So just kind of working on the eye a little bit more. Increasing some of my shadow. Adding in more of those darker eyelashes. Put a couple more on the bottom as well. And then I am going to start into the eye. That pupil is the darkest part of the eye. So when you are drawing an eye in the front view, you tend to do the pupil as a starburst. From the side, from the profile, you don't, simply because you don't see the whole pupil. You just kind of see where it is. So the highlight is on the front of the eye here. So I want to make sure that my highlight is on the front. Bring this edge out just a smidge. So that the highlight remains there. The pupil is a little bit larger. It goes kind of on the other side of the highlight. And then there will be a little bit of shading on the corner of the eye, sort of where it goes in between those eyelids. Very light, very subtle. You will want to use a tortillon there. Still leaving that reflected light on the eyelids. There is a slight shadow up here going into the eyebrow. There is a slightly darker shadow on this side, sort of beyond that crease. And it just gets lighter as it moves away from the eye. So then the eyebrow, you typically just kind of start with the hairs and the angle of them. Eyebrows actually have less value and shading in them than what most people tend to think. Partly because if we make them too distinctive and too hairy looking, then they stand out a little bit more than what they do on someone's actual face. So I'm just kind of using the motion here and overlapping those lines to get the idea of them being hairs without having every single hair showing. Now, obviously, each person has different eyebrows, so you would want to take that into consideration too. And then I'm going to use the tortillon on the eyebrow to soften some of those hairlines. And to make my highlight there not as obvious. Because remember, your brightest highlight should be on your eye, technically. Now, in this particular example, we have a couple of highlights elsewhere that are quite light, just because the shading is pretty subtle throughout. So now what I'm going to do is go ahead and get a cleaner tortillon, or wipe mine off, or whatever, and just kind of smooth in some of the skin shading. Just because there is not a lot of shading on this, most of it is in those lighter values. So we can use the tortillon to sort of soften those lighter values. You don't have to, of course. But I know that some of you are quite curious about the tortillon. Some of you have used it a lot. Others of you might need to use it less. So on and so forth. So I did want to make sure I included some tortillon use in this demo for those of you who wanted to try it. Because as I have hopefully made pretty clear, the main portion that I'm looking for when I'm grading this one is the accuracy and placement of your lines. I am going to be judging the shading a little bit, but not as heavily as I will be the line work and the placement of things. So notice that I have not used my 6B yet, because what I'm going to do is once I finish with my tortillon, I will go back in with my 6B to just deepen any of the shadows that need to be made darker. So still with the tortillon, I'm pressing down more or less, depending on how much graphite is on the tortillon and how smooth I need to make that area. I'm not going to use it on the lips because I want to make sure that the texture of those lips kind of stays what it is. I will put a little shading on the bottom of the chin here. Partly just to get rid of that line as well. Now this far edge would actually sort of just be white, and it would blend into the background so that we can tell that it's beyond the front of the chin. So I'm going to soften that to where it's barely visible. I'm going to do the same thing on parts of the nose. Just dab that with a kneaded eraser so that it's very, very light. Because typically when we are shading a face, you have a background there, you don't have an outline. The nose would go directly into the background, either fading into it or standing out against it. So now I'm just going to go in with my 6B. And once again, just very selectively darken some of those deepest areas, just to start to get the indication of the depth that would be there. Once again, I'm not focusing a whole lot on shading for this one, so it's not going to have full depth, but I do want it to have a little more depth than what it has. going to darken some of the eyelashes. And typically the eyelashes are about the last thing you'll finish because they are just very much on top of everything else on the face. Going to darken this section a little bit, not pressing down very hard since I am using a 6B, but just enough to help that lid separate from it. So then that might be my completed profile. I would then be ready to go ahead and start into my neck. I'd be ready to go ahead and start adding other details. But like I said, everything else, everything in general, even what we just drawn, is going to be contingent upon what you are seeing when you actually observe a person. So these are all just generalizations based on what it would look like if you were looking at a person and actually drawing someone. Because people's faces are very specific, they are very recognizable. So it's very important to practice being able to draw and look accurately so that you can capture things as accurately as they are, not messing things up as you go. So remember, as you are going along, you'll start with your gridding method. You'll start with all the squares, all the horizontal and vertical lines to show you sort of where things are placed. And then you'll start getting your outline on there correctly for the front edge line. Get that as accurate as you can make it before you even think about drawing any of the facial features. And think really hard about how they line up with each other, how far out or how far back they go, depending on sort of that front line here for the tip of the nose. It's very helpful to make sure that you get those lines in there at the beginning, because like I've said time and time again, if you start off with incorrect lines, you cannot fix it through the shading. The lines have to be there and as accurate as they can be before you go into the shading.